all he wants to, as he says, make America great again. He wants to make this country prosperous, safe for everybody. He wants to make American dream possible
and
again.
The title of First Lady. But along with all of that came something she had never imagined. Endless affairs, scandals, and betrayals. Behind the doors of their marriage there was no fairy tale, but a cold arrangement in which feelings slowly withered away and infidelity became the norm. And the higher Trump climbed, the deeper her faith in the very idea of family collapsed. She was always apart from the crowd. Even when thousands of flashes went off around her, even when the whole world, holding its breath, followed her every move, she remained still, like a statue carved from marble and silence. People saw her silhouette, her posture, her impeccable taste, but behind that facade no one saw anything at all. Who is this woman? Where does this icy composure come from, and that hidden sorrow in her eyes? This is the story of Melania Trump, a woman who chose silence all her life, but in that very silence lie her deepest secrets. To understand her, you need to go back to where it all began. Far away from the towers of Manhattan and the gleaming halls of the White House, in the small Yugoslav town of Sevnica, among green hills and the scent of the river, there grew up a girl who dreamed only of one thing: to escape the narrow circle of a gray life. There was nothing here to suggest that one day this girl would become the wife of one of the most famous men in the world. There was only the hum of factories, the cries of birds, and the feeling that somewhere beyond the horizon there was another life, unreachable, like a star. Since childhood, she had grown used to looking at the world slightly sideways, as if searching for a crack in reality, a door that led to a different destiny. In Sevnica, everything was predictable. A father who sold cars, a mother who worked at a textile factory, identical houses, identical faces. But inside the little Melania lived an incomprehensible longing, a strange sense that she was not born to live and die here, under the noise of factory floors and the ringing of passing trains. When other girls were playing in the yard, she would stand still, gazing at the sky, imagining that the planes above her were flying to a place where life looked nothing like this one. In Donald Trump's story, there were two women, and each became a symbol of her era: Ivana and Melania, like two opposite sides of the same mirror. Ivana was fire.
Also are a woman and you play. So if I did need something out of the man, I would know my way. I would get it. Nice, feminine way. I would get what I wanted.
Loud, brilliant, ambitious. She built businesses, commanded people, stormed into the world like a whirlwind. The world remembered her and heard her everywhere. Melania chose the opposite. She entered that same world on tiptoe, almost noiselessly. Where Ivana spoke, she stayed silent. Where Ivana went into the light, she stepped back into the shadows. It was this contrast that always amazed those around them. Two marriages to the same man, yet two completely different destinies. Ivana was like a book read aloud in public. Melania, like a book with no cover, locked away behind a closed door. And if the first sought to turn her life into a legend told out loud, the second did everything to keep her life a mystery. Perhaps that is the very essence of Melania's enigma. As if she had seen, through Ivana's example, the price of publicity and chose another way. She decided to remain unnoticed even when the world demanded her to be at the center of attention. And so her story is the story of a woman who built her armor not with words, but with silence. Life with Trump was always full of glitter, but behind closed doors it was also full of heavy words. They rarely let it show to the outside world, but those who were close to them knew. Their marriage was never a quiet fairy tale. It was a union of two people, each with a character and a truth of their own. Donald was used to commanding everything: business, the world around him, people. Melania never argued out loud, but sometimes her silence was stronger than any shout. There were moments when their quarrels were so loud that even the walls of the penthouse, accustomed to parties and voices, could not drown them out. And yet, after such storms, came long silences. She could go for weeks without saying a single word, and that silence hurt him more than any fight ever could. He was used to people agreeing, arguing, shouting, but she would simply vanish behind an invisible wall. It was in those moments that he understood he could not control everything. Melania was next to him, but she was always at a distance. Even when it seemed she had given in, had accepted his rules, there was always a place inside her that he could never enter. Sometimes, after the most difficult scandals, she would take their son and leave for a while to a place where there were no cameras, no journalists, and no him. And that was her silent way of reminding him that her life belonged to no one but herself. Their marriage had everything: passion, wealth, coldness, and that strange kind of respect that is born not from love, but from the realization that the person next to you is someone you will never be able to break. When the world was shaken by screaming headlines, when the front pages of newspapers told stories of his affairs, parties, and women, in the White House and beyond, everyone expected only one thing: that she would leave. It seemed no woman could endure such humiliation. But Melania did not take a single step aside. She did not give journalists even a shadow of emotion, not a single unnecessary phrase. That silence became her greatest weapon. Her icy gaze next to him at official receptions, her stone face in moments when the entire world was discussing his infidelities. All of it was louder than words. She knew that any reaction would be a gift to those who longed for her downfall, and so she chose to stay. Many tried to guess why. For money? For status? For her son? Perhaps all of it at once. But those who knew even a little about her character understood. It was not just dependence. It was a calculation. To leave would have meant admitting that the world had won. To stay meant to be stronger than him, and stronger than them all. Sometimes, when a wave of scandal crashed hardest into their lives, she seemed to retreat deep inside herself. In those days, she was there physically, but seemed far away, as if she lived in another reality. And that drove him mad, because next to him was a woman who did not need him in the way everyone else did. Perhaps that was the secret of her resilience. She knew her own worth, and she knew the price of the life she had chosen. And no matter what the world said, she continued to move along her own path, quietly, firmly, and without words. Melania's teenage dream of becoming a model became, however fragile, her ticket into a world where she could finally breathe freely. She left without looking back. Milan, Paris, cities that had seemed to her as if their streets were paved with gold, quickly revealed their other side. Rented apartments with peeling walls, cold evenings, and the realization that the fashion world was not a celebration at all, but an endless race for survival. With every agent's stare, with every casting call, she felt that beyond her delicate appearance there had to be something more for them to see. Not a romantic fairy tale, not an easy life, but a character that could not be broken. It was precisely that stubborn silence with which she endured every humiliation that became her weapon. She learned not to argue, not to justify herself, and not to reveal her true feelings to anyone. In photographs from that time, you can see a young girl with a closed, reserved smile and eyes that always seemed to be thinking of something else, something far away. When, in the early 90s, she arrived in New York, the city greeted her with noise and indifference. There, among the skyscrapers, she once again found herself alone. But it was in this strange and cold city that she would encounter the meeting that would change everything. A party in 1998, a hall full of light and voices, and a man who walked up to her with that same self-assured look that made so many people's knees go weak, Donald Trump. She looked at him calmly, coolly, as though she didn't even know who he was. And when he asked for her number, she simply smiled and said no. It was the first time anyone had ever told him no. That evening, she gave him not the slightest chance to think that he could easily have what he wanted. And that, precisely, was why that conversation became the beginning of their story. For her, it was not love at first sight. It was a deliberate choice not to become one of many. For him, it was a challenge that gripped him more than any beauty could. Their story unfolded slowly, nothing like the way Hollywood loves to tell it. She did not rush into his arms, and she did not try to pretend to be someone else. On the contrary, her cool restraint only fueled his fascination. Gradually, Melania began to step into a world that for most people is untouchable. Penthouses, private jets, parties where crystal glasses rang beneath the laughter of New York's most powerful, and even there she remained an observer. She liked to see that world, but she never allowed it to become her reality. She kept her distance, as if she already knew. Behind all that glitter there is always a price, and that price is too high. When their relationship turned into marriage, the world called her lucky. Slovenian model conquers Trump, the headlines screamed. But in reality, her life began in a gilded cage. Everything around her glittered: marble, gold, paintings. But behind that luxury, there was only loneliness. Every step she took was discussed by millions. Every dress, every gesture became a reason for gossip. And in this endless cacophony of voices, she chose silence. Then came the White House. For some, it is the summit of all dreams, but not for her. Her life turned into a parade, a performance in which she had to play a role without any right to step off the stage. Grand halls, endless receptions, smiles in front of cameras. But behind those smiles, there was a woman who felt like a stranger in the very center of power. She had never aspired to politics. She had never wanted to become a symbol, and that was her greatest trial. The world is accustomed to first ladies who radiate energy, launch initiatives, give speech after speech. Melania chose silence. For that, she was criticized, dissected, analyzed. Why is she like that? Why doesn't she smile? Why does she walk a step behind? Why does it sometimes seem as if she does not want to be there at all? But behind these questions, no one could hear what she heard: the constant noise of loneliness. Sometimes, when scandals erupted, when the whole world argued about her marriage, her family, her life, she simply disappeared. She left for a place where there were no cameras. There are stories about her secret refuge, another skyscraper, far from everything that reminded her of the White House, where she hid with her son. There she could once again become just a woman, not a first lady. And perhaps this is her greatest secret, that behind 2 decades of glitter, power, and flawless photographs, there is a human being who never wanted to belong to that world. A person who chose silence as the only way to survive. In the whirlwind of this brilliant but cold life, she found the one thing that became her true meaning: her son. The birth of Barron changed her in a way that even meeting Trump could not. From that day on, she no longer existed on her own. Her entire world narrowed to those small hands, to that first gaze, to the quiet breath of a child that suddenly made this vast universe feel a little warmer. They say it was for his sake that she agreed to live in the gilded cage, because she understood that in this family he would have everything she herself had once only dreamed of. Barron grew up surrounded by security and luxury, but Melania did everything she could to make sure his childhood did not become another shop window for the outside world. She shielded him from cameras with the same resolve with which she had learned to hide herself from the world. When Donald was at the center of storms and scandals, she would quietly take her son by the hand and lead him away. For her, he was not just a child. He was the one person who gave meaning to staying next to a man whose life belonged to millions. Over the years, this became especially clear. In the White House, she always tried to stay close to her son, even if that meant living differently from other first ladies. After the inauguration, she refused to move to Washington immediately and stayed in New York for months, simply because she did not want to pull Barron out of his familiar school. For him, she was ready for anything, even if it meant a new wave of criticism. Today, he is 15, tall, quiet, and just as reserved as she is. In every movement, there is that same cold gaze that once helped her endure everything. And perhaps in him lies the answer to all the questions. Perhaps he is her only true anchor. In a world where every word and every feeling becomes news, she has chosen to raise her son in silence, because she knows the value of that silence better than anyone. Many people believe that luxury can fill emptiness, but Melania understood very early that all these towers, gold, halls, and flashes are only scenery. Real life happens where no one can see you. She was always next to a man who lived on stage, while she chose to remain behind the curtain. That was her way to survive. In that shadow, she built her own small world, where there are no cameras, no reporters, only herself, her son, and rare moments of peace. Sometimes at official receptions, you could notice how her gaze, just for a second, would drift into the distance, as if she was mentally elsewhere. In those moments, it seemed that she was not a first lady, not a billionaire's wife, but that same girl from Sevnica who had once dreamed of another life. And perhaps her dream did come true, but in a way she never expected. She learned to be invisible in the most visible marriage in the world. She did not argue, did not justify herself, did not explain. She simply lived as if none of this had anything to do with her. There is something paradoxical in it. Having become a symbol of wealth and power, she remained a person who values simplicity and privacy more than anything that money can buy. And that is why her secret remains untold. Behind her perfect posture and cold smile is a human being almost no one knows. Perhaps one day, when the years are behind her, she will tell this story herself. But for now, this is her private territory, and no one is allowed to enter. She has lived a life that millions can only dream of. The most expensive homes, the rarest gowns, the halls where the fates of nations are decided, and every one of her steps watched by the entire world. But if you listen closely, behind all that glitter, there has always been another music. Quiet, barely audible, the music of loneliness. It has accompanied her path since childhood. As a girl, she dreamed of running away to a place where no one knew her. As a young woman, she escaped into a vast world only to realize that she was a stranger in it. And even when she became part of the loudest and most scrutinized union on the planet, that feeling never left. When the cameras are switched off and the doors of grand halls close, there is only herself and her thoughts. No one will ever know what she thinks about in those moments. Perhaps about how everything in life has its price, and her price turned out to be higher than she ever imagined. Perhaps about how behind every dream, which from afar seems bright and untouchable, there always stands a reality that looks nothing like a fairy tale. Melania Trump has learned to turn silence into a shield. That silence has become her home, her only protection from a world that constantly demands smiles, words, and emotions. In that silence, she has managed to preserve what is most precious: her son, her inner balance, and the part of herself that cannot be bought for any price. Her story is not a Cinderella story. It is the story of a girl who wanted to leave a small town and found herself at the center of the world, but managed to hold on to a rare quality: the ability not to dissolve into the expectations of others. She remained herself, even if no one knows what that truly means. And now, when we see her in photographs or on the news, we are looking only at a reflection. The real Melania remains behind the glass, in the shadows, in that silence she has chosen for herself. And perhaps that is why millions of people still cannot stop asking, who is Melania Trump really? There is no answer to that question. There is only the silhouette of a woman standing by the window of a high-rise. Beyond the glass hums a city that measures everything by speed and noise, while inside there is absolute silence. She looks out into the distance, and in that gaze lies an entire life, a life she will never share with anyone. She rarely spoke, but her dresses and coats often spoke louder than the most resounding speeches. In a world where every word turns into a headline, she chose another language, the language of color, fabric, and silhouette. For her, clothing became armor, a way to build an invisible wall around herself. People only saw the surface, the heels, the handbags, the perfect tailoring. Newspapers argued about who dressed her. Fashion critics dissected every detail. But no one understood the essence. Behind every look there was always a choice, sometimes a quiet protest, sometimes a desire to show that in this world she still had at least one voice, mute, but hers alone. That is why her style was always severe and restrained. There was no accident in it. Where other billionaires' wives displayed luxury, she chose a cold minimalism that seemed to say, I do not want to be part of this show. Her silhouettes were closed, as if she hid herself from everyone, leaving only a façade for the world. Each dress at official events was like a carefully constructed answer to questions she would never speak out loud. But that answer could not be translated into words. Sometimes, in rare moments when the world pressed hardest upon her, her clothing became the only way to let others know that she was alive, that behind the statue there were feelings. The clearest example of this was that jacket with the words, I really don't care, do you? On that day, it happened as if by accident. A simple jacket, something that could easily have gone unnoticed. But the words on her back flared like a challenge. For weeks the newspapers could not calm down. Whom was she speaking to? To the husband at the center of a scandal? To the press that had hounded her for years? Or to the entire world that had grown used to looking at her without ever seeing a person? Some saw a challenge in it, others an insult, others a cry for help. But those few who knew her best understood that there was nothing accidental in that message. It was the one moment when her silence turned into words. For a brief instant, she allowed the world to peek behind the wall, only so she could raise it again. Since then, people began to look more closely at her clothes, trying to guess what she was saying this time. But no one has been able to decipher it. Because for her fashion is not a game, but a quiet form of survival. Every suit, every color is another layer of armor. And while the world sees only the beauty of fabric, behind it remains the one thing that matters. A woman who has built her own way of speaking to the world without uttering a single word. The first time the doors of the White House closed behind her, for a few seconds it seemed to her that she was not in a home, but in someone else's museum, a place breathing history, but with no trace of warmth. Vast corridors stretched on, vanishing around corners, and in that silence each of her steps echoed back at her, as if reminding her that from now on, every sound in her life would be heard by millions. The halls where once Lincoln and Roosevelt had spoken seemed larger than life itself, and the more opulent the rooms, the stronger the feeling of emptiness became. By day, the White House felt like an endless theater, a constant succession of meetings, hands, cameras, the sound of footsteps, the rustle of papers, quiet voices behind closed doors, and always someone near, aides, security, journalists. But when evening came, and the doors at last closed, the silence became almost unbearable. It brought no peace. It pressed down. It lay across her shoulders like an invisible weight, a reminder that you are alone in a world where there is no one who belongs to you. Sometimes she lingered on the first floor, in the galleries lined with portraits of first ladies. A long row of women's faces, gone into history, looked down on her from the canvas. And every gaze seemed to ask the same question: are you ready for this role? But Melania knew that her role would be different. She had no intention of becoming part of that noisy legend. She wanted to make it through these years with herself intact. At night, when the city beyond the windows slept, she would walk up to the tall panes of glass and look out at the streetlights and the empty avenues of Washington. Beyond the gates was the real world, vast, unpredictable, alive. Here was another world, perfectly constructed, but lifeless in its beauty. And in those moments, the White House seemed to her not a palace, but a cage of white stone, a cage from which there is no escape, even when the door is right there. And yet, inside this cage, she learned how to breathe. She learned to hide behind her cold posture, her silence, her flawless manners. And no one ever truly understood what she felt during those long years. Because the White House taught her the most important thing, that silence can sometimes be louder than any words. And today, as the gold of Trump Tower fades, and the roar of the crowd and the bursts of camera flashes have drifted far into the past, there remains only her, Melania, a woman who once stepped into this world of luxury, believing in a fairy tale and in love, only to become a prisoner of someone else's ambitions. Years at Trump's side taught her to swallow her pain, to stay silent, to smile even when her heart was breaking. Every affair, every new woman in his life was a blow she took upon herself, slowly turning into an ice statue capable of surviving in this cold palace. She stayed by his side, but in truth she had left long ago. Between them now lie miles of silence and years of pain, and even the power of a presidency could not mend the cracks that betrayal carved into their marriage. Behind her cold gaze is not just resentment, but a quiet, almost soundless revenge, a silent demonstration that his world is a world built on lies. And one day, when it all turns to dust, the story of their marriage will remain as a symbol that even in the most lavish palaces, where everything is bought and sold, there are things that cannot be purchased and cannot be held by any amount of money or power, trust, and respect. And the price for losing them is always